In a previous video, I spoke about how R.S. Thomas's poem Comparisons uses line and lineation to transform what might otherwise have been little more than a sequence of statements, albeit highly charged ones, into a drama, the emotional and intellectual force of which we thereby experience powerfully for ourselves in the process of reading it. And I wish to add here just a few comments about how the poem's particular organisation of these lines into stanzas adds still further dimensions to this drama and this experience. So the first thing we notice of the poem's stanzas is that they're all of roughly the same size. They all consist of 3 lines. This repeated pattern, which we perceive visually before we have even begun to read the poem, gives us, I think, a preliminary sense of a method, of a rhythm. And it's a rhythm, as it turns out, that is not upheld, for instance, in the poem's metre, such as it is. So here I think we can find a preliminary and significant purpose being fulfilled by the poem's stanzaic structure. That is to say, having perceived it, we wish to find out more. It encourages us to look more closely at the individual elements that comprise each structure, to see if we can spot at the more microscopic level any rationale or grounding for this overarching and preliminary semblance of order and structure. And this is clever, I think, because it puts us in an analogous situation to the speaker of the poem. Like that speaker, that is, we are trying to connect one thing with another. We're particularly trying to connect different things of different scales. Like the speaker, then, we're looking for an underlying order, a set of connections that may not actually exist, and that even when they are attained, this attainment is at best temporary and provisional. Now there's another thing that I think the poem's division of its lines into these kinds of stanzas achieves. And this relates to the idea of the stanza as a room within which a certain kind of movement or set of movements, such as dancing, takes place. So imagine for a moment that every stanza in this poem is a dance floor of approximately the same size. Imagine too that the individual words of the poems are dances. And again, these are similar in number in each poem, but not exactly the same. What's more, each group of dancers is organised into lines of 3, and each then proceeds to dance in patterns that mark variations on a common form. Now, if you were then able to watch or look at all 5 dance floors at the same time, and to watch all 5 dances on all 5 dance floors at the same time, you would of course notice subtle variations in how individual dancers relate to their lines, and how the collective movement of each line interacts with the collective movement of the other 2 lines to create the unique pattern of each individual dance. And you would notice too how the slightest variations in each stanza, no matter how seemingly minor on their own, alter the emotional register of the stanza as a whole. In other words, each of these dances would not just look different, but somehow feel different as well. Now, of course, were you to analyse a dance as a poem, ultimately what you need to do is try to understand the larger pattern as a whole, how each individual dance contributes to the whole. But in order to do that, you would move through, as it were, each dance floor in turn. And you would notice the way that each set of dances, each dance, relates to the one that came before it, whether it mirrors it and affirms it or breaks away from it. Does the dance in each floor start again, or does it segue into one dance floor and then out of the rest? So in each case then, you would interpret the individual dance, but also the contribution it makes to the whole. In the case of this particular poem, its division into 5 stanzas helps us register both the varieties of patterns into which its words, lines and groups of lines come together and then move apart, and the corresponding progression and range of thoughts, ideas and feelings these patterns help bring to life. Now, I discussed the first stanza in the previous video on this poem, and here we might see the stanza and the line to some extent working against one another. If you take the stanza, it's complete. To all light things I compared her, to a snowflake, a feather. It's complete and it's harmonious. He's looking for a comparison, he finds it in the feather, fine. Except as we saw, the structure of the lines breaks this out by not ending the second line with her, which would rhyme with feather, but with to. The poem is showing that there's a chink here, that the comparison is not exact and may not hold. And this is precisely the scenario that the rest of the poem plays out. So the second stanza then starts afresh. But we may notice that as a sentence, it continues unbroken until the first line of the 4th stanza, on our love. So what we have here in these 2 and a bit stanzas is a very interesting interplay between form and content, between what the poem is saying and how it's saying it. Because what it's trying to do, at least in the second stanza, is depict a moment of poise, where things freeze, as it were. I remember she rested at the dance on my arm as a bird. It's a moment, it's being held, it's at rest. And the stanza structure, on one level, tries to support this. It tries to hold this up as one image that will last, a moment of resting, of not dancing, because after the word bird, we of course get the line break, the pause. At the same time, though, of course, there is not a full stop there, and the poem continues, the dance continues, the at a dance. You cannot stay still at a dance. So even though this second stanza tries to hold a moment of stillness, hold a moment of poise, this moment continues just as the dance continues. So the stanza is then working both ways. It's both trying to participate in this freezing of the moment, but the way it itself is structured, not being a complete sentence in itself, it cannot do so. It has to let the words continue. And then in the next stanza, we get, as we saw in the previous videos, some rhymes, some ends of lines, some line breaks that also, as it were, try to hold still this moment. On its nest, lest the eggs break, lest. The fear of the woman being depicted here is that if this moment becomes heavier, if it continues, if something changes, everything may fall apart. And there's so much about the stanza and line structure of this part of the poem that is working to try to hold things up, but it cannot. this too continues on our love. And as we're then told, movement in a way is a part of life. Snow, one of the images he was trying to use to capture her. Feathers, another image he was using to try to capture a sense of her. These move on, they melt, and they are blown away. So the poem is trying to hold this frozen moment, this moment of poise that was so important to her and to him and to their interpretation of their love, but it cannot. So it both enacts this poise, but also enacts its dissolution. So here too we can see how not just individual lines, but lines collected into stanza enhance the drama and action of the poem. And the final thing I would say about stanza structure in this poem is that it helps give us a sense of verticality, of going down, of dropping down this poem. This is partly, of course, because the lines are short, but also because in these middle stanzas, as we saw, they flow into one another. We read quite swiftly from top to bottom. And we're not necessarily aware that we're doing this until we come to the final stanza with its image of the anchor being let down inside him. So this is yet another way, I think, that the stanzaic patterning of this poem contributes to its drama and therefore to its meaning.